Good evening and welcome to a special edition of Ask the Clergy. I want to say at the outset that this evening we'll be operating a little differently than usual. It'll still be a program that you, our viewers, will help to create by phoning in your questions. But tonight we're going to have a distinguished theologian with us to talk about process theology. I'm Tony Perrino, minister of the Unitarian Church and moderator of the program, and with me this evening is Dr. David Griffin, who is professor of religion at the School of Theology at Claremont and the executive director of the Center for Process Studies. David, welcome to Santa Barbara and to Ask the Clergy.
Thank you.
I'll explain to our viewers, particularly our new viewers, that we always begin the program by exploring a particular topic for 15 minutes or so, and then we invite your questions. And this evening we'll ask those questions to be related to the whole concept of process theology. The number to call is 963-0911. Write it down now so it'll be handy when you think of your questions. And please make your questions brief. David, good to have you here.
Thank you.
I think the place to begin, I know you've written several books on the subject, and it's a very exhaustive subject. I have this one here called Process Theology that you wrote with John Cobb. But could you summarize in just a few sentences what process theology is all about?
Well, I was thinking at the school when we're asked to stand up and state in one word what we do, and a certain professor will stand up and say, I teach Old Testament, another New Testament. I usually just stand up and say, I teach the truth. But
and that in one word is what process theology is all about.
We like to think so.
Mm-hmm.
It's a form of theology which is based on some 20th century thought, and once again is trying to bring science and religion together in a way that it hasn't been done for the past 300 years. Those two have split apart to the detriment of both science and religion, the scientific community and the religious community. And process theology, one way to characterize it is a way to reunite these.
Reconcile science and religion. Where does the word process come from in this designation?
We're based partly on the thought of Alfred North Whitehead, and his major work was called Process and Reality, and the word stuck from that. The point that he was making was that most traditional thought in the West has made unchanging substance to be the ultimate reality.
Absolutes, particularly in religion.
As in Plato, you had the unchanging forms. In Aristotle, God was defined as the unmoved mover. In Newtonian physics, the basic particles of the world were understood to be unchanging bits of matter. In process thought, everything that is actual is understood to be active and in process. So it's an active process of becoming, and that applies to everything from electrons to God.
Including God.
Including God.
So as opposed to the traditional conception of deity, you're saying God is a reality that's also in process.
That's right. Some distinctions have to be made. God wouldn't be changing in every respect. There would be a character of God, an unchanging character. So all of the things that traditional theologians said about God as a whole, we would say about God's abstract essence, that it's unchanging. But God as actual, God as concrete, is interacting with the world. And of course, that's a biblical notion, so we're just returning to that.
It also sounds like what has traditionally been called pantheism. How does it differ from pantheism, which would say that God is inherent in everything that lives, at least? Is it the same as pantheism? Is it a form of pantheism?
No, we use the term pan-in-theism, and that in makes all the difference, because in pantheism, one is saying that literally everything is divine, and that means everything is the way it should be. So that means Hitler's Germany, etc., etc. We have to accept that as good. In this view, everything in the world has its own power, its own creativity, and it is therefore distinct from God. So all things are in God, but God is not all things. All things are not God. All things are in God. God is in all things to some degree.
this too seems a radical departure from traditional theology, which would describe God as omnipotent, as in control of everything, having the power. You're saying that God is not omnipotent, that God is the process, or at least is reflected in the process, and there are certain things over which God has no control.
The distortions of the notion of God as all-powerful that are associated with the term omnipotence have probably been the source of the worst problems with Christianity, Judaism, Islam, the Western biblical-based religions, because they took the basic religious idea, which is that deity is all-powerful in the sense that we have confidence that God, whom we think of as a God of love, whose power is love, by saying God is all-powerful, we mean that in the long run, God will win out, that love will win out.
How can you be sure of that?
Well,
if this is a process over which God has no absolute control, how can you be certain that in the long run, love will win out, God will win out?
Well, I don't think religious faith is a matter of certainty. It's a matter of faith.
So that's an article of faith with you.
But the point I wanted to distinguish this position from is the notion which all too often the traditional theologies held, is that besides God's love, God has another kind of power held in reserve, a coercive, destructive power by which God is going to get even. You have these different images of God, but this is sort of like
wrathful judge,
God, the cosmic enforcer, sort of a cosmic Clint Eastwood that will finally take care of all things, not with love, but by violent, destructive action.
One of the things that your conception of God, I want to come back to that word, by the way, and ask you why you use it, since it's so popularly interpreted differently than you do interpret it. But one of the dimensions of this conception, it seems to me, that you're dealing with very effectively with this kind of conception of deity is the problem of evil. You're saying that the traditional dilemma that people have of how can God be good and allow all this terrible evil that takes place in our world is the wrong question to ask, because God's not responsible for that. God doesn't control everything, so some of the evil that happens is really not God's responsibility. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, the notion that God exercises controlling power, either does control all things or could control all things but holds back and chooses not to, that has been one of the major reasons for atheism in the West, because it does create an intolerable problem of evil, to believe either that we're totally just puppets controlled by God, or that God could be preventing some of these really gross evils and just chooses not to. So we're saying that everything has its own power of creativity. And so in this sense, everything is in the image of God. This biblical notion that we are in the image of God now in a non-dualistic world, we surely have to generalize that to all creatures. And
have a radical freedom that allows us to do evil.
Yes, and so as you go up the scale to the higher kinds of creatures, we have more and more radical forms of evil, more and more freedom, and therefore the capacity.
But this conception of deity is very appealing to me, and I find it does answer a lot of different questions, but I'm curious, it seems so different from the traditional conceptions of God. I wonder why you hold on to the word God instead of looking for a different term, since in popular thought, at least, the word God means a person, usually a masculine person, and a person with the characteristics that you just rejected. Why does process theology continue to use the word God, since that's the case?
Well, God is the word in our tradition that is used for the chief object of worship, and so it's a religious word, and it points to that which is worthy of worship. Also, we believe that our idea of God has much in common with the biblical notion of God. We do believe that God is personal. Now, not in a lot of the pejorative senses of a finite person, a petty person, a person who loves some and not others, and a vindictive person, and all of those things, if those are associated with the notion of personhood, all those characteristics of human persons, why certainly in that sense God is not personal, but no theologian has ever thought that. But the traditional notions in Western thought were so much permeated by Greek and Roman philosophy that really changed what was the biblical notion of God, and we are returning to a view of God as interacting with the world rather than an absolute, impassible, immutable being that the early theologians defined, that we believe we've got more right to the word God than those who held that traditional notion.
What would you say to someone who said you're trying to put new wine into old wineskins, David, and they won't hold the new wine because there's just too much ferment in that radical?
Yeah. Well, it's certainly the case that words take on connotations and all sorts of baggage that you don't want to be associated with. And so one way to solve that is to quit using the word. Now, with certain words I quit using because I don't believe we can save them.
And notice you don't use the masculine pronoun when you refer to God, him.
That's right. That's right.
That's one of the things you have set aside.
That's certainly a distorting view to suggest that God is somehow more male than female. And feminist theologians are absolutely right on this point when they say that if God is male, as opposed to female, then maleness is enthroned as ultimate in the universe, and men are inherently superior to women. And that, insofar as all of our Western religions have suggested that, they need to be reformed, transformed now.
I'm again going to come back to something that puzzles me, and that is, and maybe this too is an article of faith with you rather than something that comes out of your hard thought logic. All of your descriptions of the reality that you term God seem to me appealing, and would probably be appealing to a lot of people who have a need to reconcile science and religion, except when you insist on holding on to the personhood of God. Why that dimension? Because it seems that all of that you described could be true of a kind of a Taoistic force inherent in life itself, the evolutionary thrust that produces more and more complex reality. Why characterize it as a person, that force?
This is something that if I were going to try to justify it, I would have to get more technical than we should get at this time. But briefly, let me say that there's been a lot of reaction, of course, in the modern world against the notion of some sort of anthropomorphic God, if we use ourselves as an analogy. And the feeling is that some such views are not very sophisticated. But quite often then people replace that view of the universe with a view of the universe as machine. And I wonder why a mechanomorphic universe is more somehow sophisticated. Or people will then use an ocean or an overflowing fountain as the basic metaphor for understanding deity. And it doesn't seem to me that's more sophisticated.
Well, you used the word earlier of worshiping this God. And I don't know how you worship a process. It seems to me that would be difficult, that a process is more abstract, and it may have to do with a personal need to relate to the reality, and you relate better to persons. We're going to have to take a commercial break at this time. And
I will want to retort to that.
I want you to respond to that when we come back. We'll be back shortly. Welcome back. David, when we broke, you were going to respond to this question of worshiping a personal God, or why do you regard God as a person rather than a process?
Yes, and not just for religious reasons. Some people do it on that basis, but we do it also for philosophical reasons. That, I can put it this way, some people think it's wrong to take one certain segment of the universe and use that as an analogy for God rather than some other. So they say, why take a human person rather than a rock or an ocean? It seems arbitrary. But in our view, to get into some of the philosophical aspects of it, experience is what is fundamental in the nature of the universe. In fact, to be actual is to be an experience. Now that's a very difficult thought for people.
Actual is to be an experience.
Yes, there's nothing that's really actual.
You're saying that God can't be real as a process, can only be real as an experience that you have. But why couldn't you experience this reality other than as a person?
Okay, I was going to make a slightly different point here in terms of analogy, that since we believe that everything that is an individual actuality in the world is an experience, to say that God is an all-inclusive experience and is not to take one segment of the universe rather than some other segment as the basic analogy for understanding God. So we're not taking human beings as opposed to other things as the analog for God. We're saying that everything that is actual is an experience, and so if God is actual, it makes sense to understand God as in analogy with experience as we know it from within as a human being. That's what we have. But God is analogous then to all actual things. And in that sense...
Doesn't that sound a bit like anthropomorphism? That is, we're picturing God then as ourselves, something like ourselves, personality.
But from our point of view, and here it depends on one's particular philosophical point of view, we're not picking on humans as opposed to other things because we're seeing all things as experiences. So it's not particularly anthropomorphic, it's just saying that experience as such is the analog, it's the basis, the metaphor, and we understand God in analogy with experience. Now certainly, since we're human beings, it's human experience that we know from within. It's human experience that we know what that is in itself. And so that's the highest form of experience that we know, but surely there would be on other planets probably forms of experience much higher than ours. And so they would be more analogous to the divine experience than ours, than our own.
So you wouldn't be limiting God in that respect by personalizing the reality.
Yeah, don't mean to be.
Right.
Yeah.
Where does Jesus fit into process theology? I want to, I guess, preface that by a remark that it seems to me that, and our first call is coming in, so we'll have to take it soon, but I remember reading in some of your material that process theology can relate to Judaism, Taoism, any of the great world religions, but you're coming out of a Christian tradition.
Yes.
In developing process theology. What is your conception of Jesus in that context?
Yes, so I need to distinguish between process thought or process philosophy in general, and then how Christian theologians have used it, such as myself.
Okay.
We would see Jesus, for one thing, one category that has been central to me is the notion of revelation. And we see Jesus as the supreme revelation of God. Not the only, not the exclusive. We believe God is working always and everywhere, but that given the conditions and given Jesus' response, from our point of view, decisive revelation of the character and the mode of agency of God and the purpose of God came about here.
But not God. Jesus is not God, but he is a revelation of God.
That's right. And God was, we use also the term incarnation, but that's the way God works always and everywhere.
And it sounds from what you say that it's conceivable, at least in your thinking, that Buddha might have also revealed the same God to his people and so forth.
I believe God was active through Buddha, as I believe that God has been active in all things, and certainly in all people. But the category of revelation of God is not particularly a category that applies to Buddhism. That's not what Gautama was up to. God was not even God was something that the Buddha denied. So we can differentiate that God has been effective in different ways,
right.
And within the biblical traditions, the category of revelation of the nature of God is a particularly helpful category. It's not helpful in regard to certain other religions.
When you're saying the highest revelation for you is seen in Jesus. By denying the deity of Jesus, or at least by inference, regarding Jesus as the highest revelation of the deity, but not identifying Jesus with deity, you're really setting aside the Trinitarian formula, at least of traditional Christianity. You're really not within the framework of Orthodox traditional Christianity, is that right? And how do you get away with this at a school of theology that's educating people for the Christian ministry?
For those in the audience who don't know, of course, Tony's a Unitarian, so that was a good Unitarian question, leading the witness.
A non-Trinitarian.
Sure. If the doctrine of the Trinity meant somehow that there were three persons in the Godhead, then we would be denying that. But almost all traditional theology has denied that no one, very few were saying that there are three persons in our sense of the term person. In Greek thought, persona meant something quite other, in fact was used deliberately to deny that these were distinct individuals. So the fact that we deny the Trinity in that sense doesn't make us distinct from most anybody else.
Yeah. What about the concepts of heaven and hell? How did that fit into process theology? It doesn't sound like there'd be much room for such conceptions.
There's certainly no room for hell, if by that one means some place or dimension that God in a vengeful way is going to send people who don't believe the right things or do the right things. That whole notion is another one of the aspects of traditional theology that is just incredible. It's incredible when you say that this started as a religion of love and saying the chief aspect of God is love, and then to end up with notions that God has eternally predestined certain people to eternal damnation. It's just it's a tragedy, and so many people believe they must reject traditional religion, reject Christianity because they assume it's somehow connected with those things. And of course, what we still see on a lot of television reinforces that notion. For many people, that's still the image of Christianity that they get for 5 seconds as they
hellfire and brimstone
move the channels. So any notion like that is such they're such unchristian notions that it's incredible and very tragic that such have ever been held.
How about the idea of heaven?
Here it would depend on what you meant, and here I would need to distinguish between some process theologians and others. Many process theologians have not thought that that there is any possibility of talking about life beyond bodily death at all.
So they wouldn't believe in immortality in the traditional sense.
Immortality or resurrection in any kind of literal sense. Many process theologians have talked about, and I talk about, objective immortality, meaning that everything we do is taken up into God and cherished everlastingly. So it's a sense in which our lives have meaning because the universe will not go on and be as if we hadn't been. And that's a very important notion.
Where does this happen?
Where does that happen?
Where does God cherish someone everlastingly? How?
Well, God is omnipresent. God is the all-inclusive reality, as I say. So it's right here as much as anywhere.
It's not a place. Heaven's not a place.
But I want to go ahead and indicate that my own views have changed somewhat in the last few years. In fact, since I participated in writing that book, and through evidence of parapsychology, and many people now know about out-of-body experiences and various other, but there's all sorts of really well-documented evidence, both of a anecdotal sort and also of laboratory evidence that is very cumulative and done by very first-rate people, which in a cumulative way suggests that we do live on in some way beyond bodily death. Now, process philosophy...
There's something called a soul that does survive the death of the body.
So process philosophy, Whitehead's philosophy, allows for that, and he specifically says that, and says it would be a question then of empirical evidence. Well, most of us hadn't paid any attention to the empirical evidence, but then about 3 years ago, when I did pay some attention to it, I decided it was very impressive. And so...
And the empirical evidence is in the field of parapsychology?
For the most part. For the most part. But, I mean, it's what's now called parapsychology, but these kinds of reports have been this kind of evidence comes from every tradition, from every period of history. So it's really very massive.
There is some evidence in the what would be called the harder sciences. Barbara Brown, specifically, who's an MD that's done research on the brain, recently came up with the conclusion that there is such thing as a mind which exists apart from the body and very well might survive the extinction of the body, which shocked the scientific world, of course, for her to say that.
That's right. Modern thought, and I use that as a technical term to refer to the thought that has developed since the 17th century to the 20th century, has increasingly been materialistic, and in terms of the mind-body relation then, has more and more, in terms of philosophers, have adopted a position called identism. That is, that the mind is identical with the brain. And so if that's the case, then there's no possibility of survival, and so therefore most people who've held that view haven't even been interested in looking at the empirical evidence because they knew in advance it couldn't be.
But postmodern science is saying something different.
Yes, that term has started to be used, and I'm using that term in regard to Whitehead's philosophy and others talking about postmodern thought. And it's not as dogmatic, it's not as rigid, it is not materialistic, and it doesn't limit human experience to sense experience, which is a crucial issue. So in principle, the kinds of things that are called extrasensory perception, Whitehead's philosophy would lead one to expect those, because he says that we have a kind of pre-sensory experience that is more fundamental than sensory experience.
Let's see, David, I guess one of the other things I wanted to, well, let's finish what you were doing with the modern science thing, because it seems to me that's, modern science is opening up all kinds of new areas that relate to theology, the modern physics particularly, with its notion that ultimate reality is not matter but energy, and matter is simply a frozen state of energy, and that, for example, we could conceive of immortality in terms of the old Hindu concept of we are an Atman, an expression of the ultimate energy, and we return to that larger energy at the time of death. But it doesn't sound like that's the kind of immortality you're describing. You're describing a much more personal survival of ego identity.
Yeah, except that ego has such pejorative terms, meaning self-centered and all of that. So, well, certainly the ego could survive, but the hope is that we will get rid of that after a while and have the true self
which
survive.
Does not have an ego.
But let me say a word about this postmodern thought, because it's most important in terms of the general religious situation in the world, and in this country in particular, where you've got such a disparate range of religious belief. And so you have fundamentalists who totally reject modern science because they see that, quite rightly, they see that some of the theories, such as neo-Darwinianism, the way it has normally been interpreted, is hostile to any kind of religious worldview, so they think they have to reject this altogether. And so you have a big gap between religion, between liberal and conservative and fundamentalist religions. Our hope is that our kind of postmodern thought can help gaps and bring people back closer together again, where they can respect each other and see each other as concerned about similar things. For example, there is a big conference dealing with process theology and Unitarian theology in Dallas this December. Also, there are groups of evangelical Christians around the country who are looking at process theology very seriously, because they see that its postmodern way helps them make some of the affirmations they want to make.
And reconciles with science.
And there are Jewish theologians now who are looking at process theology and seeing that it can help them, and there are even Buddhists who are seeing that process philosophy helps them. So we're able then also to bridge some between East and West.
Okay. I want to come back to the worldwide nature of this, but let me see if we can get through on a call now. Hello, you're on the air.
Hello, Tony.
Yes.
I have a little quotation here I took out of the Times the other day.
Okay.
But a person wrote in and said, I believe when Jesus comes again, he probably will be a woman, and most likely she will be black.
Uh-huh.
And another one was this about, they always say, here it says here, our God is our Father, and therefore male. Shouldn't they equally question Satan's gender?
Okay.
Thank you.
I'll ask Dr. Griffin to speak to that. Well,
those are...
The only implicit question in there has to do with this gender identification
Sure.
of deity, but the last little wrinkle was...
Well, the racial also, because
Yes.
one of the worst tendencies of human beings is to take the universal creator of all and then say that creator is especially like us.
Like
so
us,
whether we
sure.
say white or male or whatever,
Sure.
so the various forms of liberation theology are helping us break some of these narrow images that never should have existed in the first place.
Yes, and the implication about whether or not Satan should be similarly characterized is a good one. I once read that in some of the African tribes, the character of Satan is depicted as a blue-eyed blonde rather than the swarthy, dark figure that is in Western culture tends to be depicted as Satan.
If Satan's called the temptress, why then that would certainly be...
Answer that question, right. Tell us a bit about the, you implied, a worldwide network of people interested at least in process thought. I know the Center for Process Studies has affiliates and members all over the United States, and how wide and extensive is that network?
Well, all over the world. We have, to give an illustration, in Japan this coming summer, there will be the second International Whitehead Conference, and it will be focusing upon images of nature and images of the future, East and West, and asking how Whiteheadian process thought can help bring together different intuitions or revelations about the nature of reality.
Between different religious faiths, you mean?
Sure, into a more inclusive view. Because if we really believe that that our God that we're trying to talk about in our partial and halting ways is the creator of all things, and if we take seriously the notion that this God is a loving God and loves all of the creatures that have been brought forth, then it seems incredible to assume that all the truths and values in relation to such a deity would come only out of one tradition, or one or two, if we say Hebrew and Greek.
So you would not hold the traditional biblical view that only those who believe in Jesus as Lord and Savior are saved?
Well, that's not even really the biblical view. You have one notorious passage that suggests that, but even at Vatican II, the Catholics have now reinterpreted that passage. Now, if one means, when you say only through Jesus can one be saved, and if the notion there really is that through Christ, meaning the primordial logos, what the early theologians called the logos, if we mean only through that saving, loving power that was manifested in Jesus, only through that power is anyone created and brought to fulfillment, brought to wholeness, brought to salvation. Well, certainly that's correct, but
as long as you say, at least it'll be appropriate to and acceptable to other religious traditions, as long as you say that that power can be experienced in other persons.
Sure, and early Christianity with the Logos theologians insisted upon that. It was only other narrow-minded people who tried to limit God's love and
There's
affection.
another caller waiting. Let me pick it up. Hello, you're on the air. Hello.
Yes, you talking to me?
Yes. You have a question?
I want you to know, yes, I have a question. I first want to compliment you both. I think you are very powerful, very wonderful man. I think you're tremendous. I would like to follow you around. I'm sure you heal the sick, make the lame walk, the blind see, even raise the dead. I think it's wonderful. You can just see the depth of belief in you. Also, I would refer you, I'm sure you're very excited to the old, oh, I'm not sarcastic.
You sure?
To the Old Testament, If evil is done in the city, is it not the Lord God who doeth it? Also it reminds you of our Lord's words, or of St. Paul's words. If we deny him, he will deny us.
Okay, I think we'll deal with those questions. Thank you for calling. What the caller was, he said he wasn't being sarcastic, but it sounded like he was being a bit sarcastic. But he was raising a very serious question, and he uses a couple of quotations from the Bible which contradict some of the things you've said, David. One was having to do with the evil and the power, and the other had to do with denying the unique lordship of Jesus.
Sure.
I think, in fairness, those have to be dealt with.
Sure. Take the first one first. There is a passage from Amos. If evil is done, is it not Yahweh who does it?
Mm-hmm.
This depends upon what one means if one is going to talk about revelation or inspiration. How do we conceive of the Divine Spirit inspiring people and revealing something about what's going on?
Mm-hmm.
And if one assumes that every word in the Bible is inspired, of course, then one gets in all sorts of difficulties because there are passages that contradict other passages. So that has been dismissed by leading theologians for a long time, that notion of revelation. If one, you can look at certain passages in the Bible and they will suggest that view of God, that God in fact does evil. But
so really your answer to the first question is that in process theology, at least, it isn't believed that every word of the Bible is the word of God, quote unquote, and infallible. But these are the words of human beings, and they do contradict each other sometimes. And
sure. And in regard to that, we're not much different than most theology since the 18th century. So there's nothing new about this. What's new about us is that we do go ahead then and talk about a real sense of inspiration, but it's not in this kind of infallible sense. And it follows from what I said earlier, that we all have our creativity. Well, anybody that God is inspiring, that person has his or her own creativity. And so God cannot unilaterally just dictate certain truths to be written down. So if someone's presupposing that revelation occurs that way, that means one is presupposing precisely the doctrine of God that I'm denying. So it becomes very circular.
Okay, the second part of the question, implicit at least in the statement, was that the Bible says explicitly that those who deny Christ, the unique lordship of Christ, won't be saved. And how do you deal with that kind of statement? Same answer?
First of all, it doesn't say that. Now, some people want it to say that, and so they try to read that into certain passages. The New Testament has all different notions of how Jesus is saving and how Jesus was related to God. Certainly, Jesus did not think Jesus was simply God. I mean, you don't pray to yourself. Jesus prayed to God that he called Abba, Daddy, Father, Papa.
And he also said, not those who call me Lord, Lord, but those who do the will of the Heavenly Father.
Sure.
Yeah. Okay, let's go to another question. Hello, you're on the air.
Yes. What is the role of prayer in process theology?
Okay.
Yes, that's a good question, and quite often when I am out talking to lay people, that's one of the first questions they ask, and rightly so, because vital religious life revolves around prayer life. The first thing to say is that it makes much more sense in process theology than it did in traditional Western theologies, because if you ask Augustine, Thomas, Aquinas, Luther, Calvin, and so on, they defined God as totally immutable. God cannot be affected by the world at all. So by definition, God could
prayer would be a waste of time.
God could not be affected by prayer. That's
intercessory prayer would be a waste
any
of
kind
time.
of prayer would be a waste of time. Finally, anything is a waste of time because God's already done everything, according to Calvin.
Oh, I see what you mean.
That's the unfortunate implication of that, holding to that kind of omnipotence.
So you do believe in prayer?
I do believe in prayer. Then one would need to distinguish certain kinds of prayer. Now, quite often when one thinks prayer, one thinks intercessory prayer, asking for things. And I believe there is a role for that, but that's not the basic form of prayer.
Isn't that asking God to intervene, though, in the process, and to do so is to contradict human freedom?
Well, that's not quite the way I'd put it, but I would put it a different way. I wanted to first say what I thought was a more fundamental form of prayer. I think the basic form of prayer that we should engage in is an attempt to open ourselves up to God, that we should be trying to listen and not trying to tell God a lot of things, first of all. And so to get ourselves into a state where we might listen to the still small voice. And so to try to align ourselves with the will of God should be the basic role of prayer. But then, in regard to intercessory prayer, I would rather talk in terms of, and that may be one of those terms that should go because it carries so much baggage. And it's a very insulting notion to suggest there are certain things that we know that God doesn't know, and we know better what God should be doing,
what he ought to be doing,
and all of that.
She ought to be doing.
So any notion of intercessory prayer like that, I would think, would be pre-Christian, pre-Jewish, pre-everything, and we should be done with it. We should have been done with it long ago.
Okay, we need to take another break, I guess. I'm getting a signal to do that, and we'll be back in just a moment. Welcome back. David, when we took the break, you were talking about the Process Theology's conception of prayer, and certainly your view of intercessory prayer was not the typical manipulation of deity, the regarding of God as some kind of cosmic errand boy who's going to run around and fix things for you. But it sounded like you had more to say about prayer in that context.
Yes, I didn't want to dodge the gentleman's question by just saying what I didn't believe. I believe that in line with what I was saying earlier about that we have creativity, and human beings have a very high level of creativity, and that we are interpenetrating each other. We are members one of another, as St. Paul suggested. And that one of the gifts we have is the capacity directly to influence each other for good. And so that a kind of intercessory prayer, say for healing, should be a prayer to make ourselves into appropriate channels through which the divine creativity can work for healing purposes. Now that's a way of understanding how some of this healing really comes about. It really occurs, as much as some moderns would want to just deny it. It really does occur, but the question is, how do we explain it? And this is a way of explaining it which doesn't then make God arbitrary, as if God just arbitrarily chooses to heal this person in response to prayer and not this person. So my view suggests that insofar as we are able to open ourselves to allow ourselves to receive the divine healing spirit, then healing may work through us. And in that sense, intercessory prayer is a very important and most religious activity to engage in. And our postmodern thought gives people a new basis for that.
Is it fair to say that an implication of that thought, though, is that the energy for healing that God can express requires a channel, and if you don't make that channel available, God cannot act?
That's right. God does not work unilaterally. So in the healing, for example, it requires the healer to be open to God. It also may require certain psychic constitution, particular gifts. Paul talks about that in the New Testament. Certain people have these gifts, certain people have these gifts. Some people just don't have the gift for this. Now maybe they can develop it through spiritual discipline, through prayer, but right now maybe they don't have it. So that would be why sometimes a prayer wouldn't be effective. But also the person to be healed has to, at some level,
be receptive,
want to be healed and not block that. Yeah.
How do you know, how do you deal with this empirically in terms of, because there is such a thing as psychosomatic medicine and people's belief that they're going to be healed, is actually that belief part of the process of the healing? And how do you know that it's God acting and not some psychosomatic event?
Well, I wouldn't even distinguish too radically between those, because that would be one of the ways God works. But just empirically, as you look at the different kinds of cases, there do seem to be cases of healing where the person who was being healed didn't even know that anything was going on, at least at the conscious level.
Their participation isn't required then.
At least
I think we
at
have
the
another
conscious
call,
level.
so let's take it. Hello, you're on the air.
Good evening, Tony. It's Jerry Vaughn.
Oh, hi, Jerry. Jerry is the minister of the Foursquare Gospel Church and one
Great.
of our regular panelists on this program. I'm glad to hear from you, Jerry.
My question is Dr. Griffin said that Jesus is the supreme revelation of God.
Yes.
If Jesus is the supreme revelation of God, and Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, and the light, and no man comes to the Father but by me, how do you reconcile that with what you're saying tonight, Doctor?
Okay, good question, Jerry. Thank
Okay.
you for calling. He's again quoting a
Sure.
statement that's attributed to Jesus, which seems to imply that he did see himself as the
Sure.
one way.
And that's a statement from the Gospel of John.
Right.
And people who try to sort out the historical Jesus from the later additions that were made about Jesus do not use the Gospel of John as a basis for information about Jesus of Nazareth. The Gospel of John is a most beautiful gospel in which the gospel writer has said, here is what Jesus has meant to me. Jesus to me is the way, the truth, and the life. And he then wrote that as if
Jesus said it.
as Jesus. And of course he knew that the Jesus of history, Jesus of Nazareth, didn't say those words, and he knew his readers knew that. So
So you're saying that the three synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, which depicted more clearly the historical Jesus, are radically different in their even self-image that Jesus projects than the Gospel of John, which more expresses the Christ of faith rather than the historical Jesus.
sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, that you have much more historical material in the three synoptics.
Okay.
That's nothing unique to process theology. That's been
That's been in
common
fact,
consensus.
That was the
for-
distinction that was made in my theological school between the Christ of history, Christ of faith, and the Jesus of history. Okay. Hello, you're on the air.
Hello.
Yes.
Dr. Griffin, I understand that there are some plans afoot for the development or establishment of a center to study and promote process theology in the Santa Barbara area. What are the plans and what are the financial realities involved in such a project?
Thank you very much for your question. It almost sounds like a put-up question, but it really wasn't. But
I do recognize the voice.
do you? So it is someone you know.
But I didn't tell him to call.
To make sure our viewers heard the question, it simply has to do with plans for setting up a center, at least in Santa Barbara, for the pursuing of process studies, process theology.
Yes. Yes, we've had an institution called the Center for Process Studies, which has existed at the School of Theology at Claremont
Yes.
for 10 years now. We're in our 11th year. And during this period, we have done all sorts of different things. Now we're interested in branching out and doing some really big things. And one of the big things we've thought of doing here in Santa Barbara, which would be to bring together people from various disciplines, such as physics and biology at one end of the spectrum, and
Not just theologians.
right, and scientists and social scientists and philosophers and theologians and ethicists, and let them work together for 10 years to really try to flesh out this postmodern paradigm or postmodern philosophy built on postmodern science that we alluded to earlier. And so we've begun the process of talking to people in Santa Barbara about this.
So you would set up a center here where people from these various disciplines would come together, regularly dialogue together, and try to produce a synthesis of all postmodern thought.
Yes, we're talking about a very big project that would take something like $8 million. But given the magnitude of the job and the importance of doing it, I'm confident that as we get the word out, there will be people who do this. If I can
Sure.
put in a plug here, I can say anybody interested in finding out more of this, well, can check with you if they can't locate me, or can call me at the School of Theology at Claremont in the 714 area. Incidentally, I'm teaching some courses at your
Yes, I was going to plug that. Why don't you let me plug that?
Okay.
If you want to pursue this in more detail, every Sunday evening for the next 3 weeks at least, Dr. Griffin will be teaching a course on process theology at the Unitarian Church from 7 to 9 p.m., and so you can come and pursue it in more detail. I think it's also important for our viewers to know that this center project, which is in just the infancy stage, is involving Roman Catholic priests, Father Cordano, Jewish rabbi, Rabbi Kendall, and some people from different religious traditions, as well as from
Episcopalians, Baptists,
yes.
The whole spectrum.
So it is a broader...
plus people who aren't particularly identified with any institutional religion.
Well, let's take another call, and then we'll have to wrap up soon. Hello, you're on the air.
Yes, I'd like to ask if process theology allows for a personification of evil, that is, Satan or the devil, and where does the problem of temptation to evil figure into process theology?
Very good. Thank you very much. Do you allow for a personification of evil?
Not in a literal sense of there being a cosmic Satan somewhat comparable to the cosmic God.
What is the source of evil then?
The source of evil is our own creativity, and then our own power, and then the power of the past upon us. So to a great extent, you can talk about fields of force that we're born into. And
that explains the evil that's caused by human beings.
Yes.
What about what is described as natural evil?
Yes.
Disease, earthquake?
Well, as I said before, we believe that everything that's actual, so not just human beings, but animals, cells, molecules, everything that's an individual has its own power. So there is no part of the world that is just simply being determined by God.
So some of the natural evil is just chance expression of some of this. Wouldn't you also, at least I think I heard you say in your introductory lecture last Sunday evening, that we live in an incomplete universe, and the completing of it is part of the creativity task that we are assigned.
Yes.
Is that right? And some of the natural evil would be an expression of the incompletion of the universe.
Sure, there's
a fair statement?
Paul's statement about the whole creation is groaning, waiting.
Yes.
This would be a way in which process theology really stresses process, and although we don't have any, as of yet, Eastern Orthodox people involved in Santa Barbara, that the Eastern Orthodox view, built on Irenaeus and other early Greek theologians, that the creation wasn't completed long ago, but God is still creating the world. We're only part way through. It's not that the creation is done and now we're doing something else. We're still in the making.
And we're called to be co-creators, in effect, by this conception of deity.
That's right.
I would assume.
We're called to cooperate.
We're almost out of time, and it's probably the wrong time for me to throw you a question like this, but it sounds like there are tremendous social implications to what you're saying as far as the world around us and people's relations. Can you have a quick response to that? Seems to me there's a great...
Sure. There are so many ways to go. One would be to talk about the ecological situation, the dualistic view that we've had between humans and nature, where we have thought that nature was just here as dead matter to be used for human beings' sake and comfort. That has contributed greatly to the ecological crisis, as we've just used nature as means to our end rather than seeing all things as our fellow creatures that God cares about.
Okay, I think we're going to have to wind up there.
That's too bad. I had my best answer.
I'm sure you did.
Still to come.
I want to thank Dr. David Griffin and say that we'll be back next week with our regular panel, but with a special guest, Father Richard Sparks from Catholic University in Washington, D.C., a moral theologian. Join us for Ask the Clergy next week. Bye for now.